Perhaps the ultimate source of all phenomena related to UAP is interdimensional in nature. If that's the case, how can we reconcile the biological and nuts and bolts elements often reported in eyewitness testimony with something that originates outside the familiar boundaries of three-dimensional space? It's also possible that the so-called high strangeness component is a separate layer altogether, while the physical aspects, such as craft and beings, represent only one facet of the phenomenon. Could something that exists in a higher dimensional realm even manifest itself to beings constrained by a lower dimensional perspective? Alternatively, the phenomenon may not be interdimensional in the manner we assume, but instead something extra-dimensional or even ultra-dimensional, each implying a slightly different interaction with our perceived reality. Hello everyone, and welcome to UAP as NHI. In part 4 of the NHI Origins miniseries, I explore the Interdimensional Hypothesis, offering a range of arguments both supporting and challenging the idea that it might account for the UAP phenomenon. In this episode, I break down the IDH, examine its various interpretations, and assess its potential as an origin point for non-human intelligence. The IDH has surged in popularity in recent years. One could argue it's currently in vogue among theorists and enthusiasts, much as comparable frameworks may have once been popular in ancient times, when people tried to explain strange, anomalous experiences using the language and beliefs available to them. Although those encounters were labeled differently across regions and eras, the resemblance to some modern reports suggests they describe the same basic phenomena, interpreted through the cultural lens of each period. At times it may seem as though I'm being critical of the IDH, but that's not the goal of this program. Given how widely accepted and increasingly embraced the hypothesis has become, my intent is to offer a more balanced perspective. While I continue to regard it as a strong possibility, I also aim to explore alternative interpretations of what interdimensional might actually mean. At its core, the IDH suggests that UAP and their associated non-human intelligences may originate not from other planets or star systems, but from parallel dimensions, alternate realities, or other realms of existence that somehow coexist with our own. Rather than traversing vast interstellar distances, these entities would instead cross between dimensions, possibly through mechanisms akin to wormholes, portals, vibrational shifts, or quantum-level transitions, allowing them to appear and disappear seemingly at will. Proponents of the IDH often point to the high strangeness and absurdity reported in many UAP encounters, which do not always conform to physical laws as we understand them. Witnesses describe beings and craft that defy gravity, phase in and out of visibility, exhibit time dilation effects, or even interact with human consciousness in deeply personal or symbolic ways. These qualities suggest that the phenomena may originate from a reality with different ontological rules, perhaps overlapping ours only occasionally or under specific conditions. The IDH provides a potential framework for explaining the mythological and folkloric consistency of non-human entities across cultures and eras. Gods, fairies, jinn, spirits, and modern-day aliens may all be cultural interpretations of the same underlying interdimensional presence. This hypothesis also aligns with theories in quantum physics, multiverse models, and consciousness studies, which increasingly entertain the idea that our universe may not be the only layer of reality. While the IDH lacks direct empirical support, as do any of the other interpretations, it remains a compelling alternative to the extraterrestrial hypothesis, especially when considering the more surreal, psychological, and symbolic dimensions of the phenomenon. It shifts the focus away from advanced spacefaring civilizations toward the possibility of realities and intelligences that coexist invisibly alongside us, accessible not through methods of propulsion, but through shifts in perception, frequency, or the fabric of space-time itself. Although the IDH is used as a generic term for any type of higher dimensional entity as it relates to the UAP phenomenon and potential NHI, there are actually three distinct interpretations. Let's start with a general interpretation of the IDH. It posits that UAP and associated NHI originate not from distant planets, but from parallel realities or dimensions that exist alongside our own. These are often conceived as separate but coexistent worlds or planes of existence, realms that occasionally intersect with our own, whether intentionally or accidentally. IDH is frequently invoked to explain the dreamlike or surreal aspects of UAP encounters, such as time distortion, entity behavior that defies physics, or incidents that seem more psychological than physical. These dimensions may operate on entirely different ontologies or rules of reality, and interaction with them may depend as much on consciousness or perceptual thresholds as on physical mechanisms. Because of this, the IDH is often associated with folklore traditions, for example, fairies, jinn, or spirit realms, and modern theories involving altered states of awareness or non-local consciousness. The extra-dimensional hypothesis, while related, is grounded more firmly in theoretical physics. It suggests that UAP and NHI may emerge from higher spatial dimensions, as proposed by string theory, M theory, or brain cosmology. In this view, there may be more than the three spatial dimensions we experience, and beings or technologies from the fourth, fifth, or higher dimensions might be capable of intersecting with our reality in ways that appear miraculous or impossible. Much like a three-dimensional object passing through a two-dimensional plane would appear bizarre and unintelligible to a flatland observer, entities from higher dimensions might phase in and out of visibility, seem to change shape, or ignore our conventional laws of motion and time. The EDH frames these behaviors not as metaphysical phenomena, but as literal byproducts of geometry and physics operating beyond human comprehension. A third variant, the ultra-dimensional hypothesis, builds on elements of both IDH and EDH, but adds an ontological hierarchy to the equation. Ultra-dimensional entities are not merely from parallel worlds or higher dimensions. They are from realms that supersede or transcend our own in fundamental ways. These beings may exist beyond space-time entirely, and their interactions with our world may be intentional and directed, sometimes even spiritual or cosmic in nature. Examples would include actual or interpreted gods, angels, and demons, or progenitors of a simulated or virtual universe. Importantly, the term ultradimensional should not be confused with the ultra-terrestrial hypothesis, which more generally refers to intelligences that have always been here, hidden from human perception, regardless of ultimate origin, whether interdimensional, subterranean, or psychological. My specific interpretation of the UTH is that they are a crypto-terrestrial civilization that may have ascended to or simply make use of higher dimensional space, but actually originated on Earth as a physical three-dimensional species. In other words, they evolved prior to or hidden from early hominins and later developed highly advanced technology in order to utilize, traverse, or perhaps even reside in higher dimensional space. In sum, while all three hypotheses, interdimensional, extradimensional, and ultradimensional, explore the idea that UAP and NHI originate from realities beyond our own, they differ in emphasis. The IDH focuses on parallel worlds and altered perception, the EDH on higher spatial dimensions and physical interaction, and the UDH on transcendent intelligences that may operate beyond both space and time. Together, they represent an evolving framework for interpreting the phenomenon without defaulting to traditional extraterrestrial models. IDH Origins. Although Jacques Vallée was not the first to suggest that the UFO phenomenon might involve interdimensional or non-physical entities, he was among the most influential voices to develop and popularize the idea in a systematic and scholarly way. During the 1960s and 1970s, Vallée began challenging the prevailing extraterrestrial hypothesis, arguing that it failed to account for the full scope of the phenomenon, particularly its historical, folkloric, and psychological dimensions. In works like Passport to Magonia, 1969, he drew parallels between modern UFO encounters and ancient accounts of fairies, demons, and other folkloric entities, suggesting a continuity that pointed not to beings from distant planets, but to something far more complex and possibly closer to home, perhaps originating from a parallel or hidden aspect of reality. While Vallée's ideas were groundbreaking, earlier thinkers had already planted some of the conceptual seeds. Writers like Charles Fort in the early 20th century had speculated that unexplained phenomena, including mysterious beings and aerial lights, might originate from unknown realms or alternate dimensions of space. Though Fort's approach was more literary and speculative than scientific, his work introduced the notion that we might be interacting with intelligences from concealed layers of reality. What set Vallée apart was his interdisciplinary perspective and his insistence on examining the phenomenon through multiple lenses: technological, cultural, mythological, and psychological. Rather than viewing UAP strictly as evidence of spacefaring visitors, he proposed that the phenomenon might function as a kind of control system, interacting with human consciousness, subtly shaping belief systems and behaviors over time. In this way, Vallée became a central figure in articulating what would later be referred to as the interdimensional hypothesis, even if he didn't coin the term himself. His work laid the foundation for later researchers to explore the idea that non-human intelligences may operate from realms beyond our ordinary perception, possibly existing outside the limits of conventional physics and materialist thinking. It's important to note that Vallée was historically skeptical of UFO crash retrieval claims, especially during the earlier stages of his career when his focus leaned heavily on the symbolic, mythological, and psychological aspects of the phenomenon. He viewed the nuts and bolts interpretation, stories involving crash saucers and alien bodies, as overly simplistic, often grounded in Cold War-era science fiction tropes. To Vallée, such materialist explanations seemed inadequate when it came to encounters involving high strangeness, time distortions, psychic effects, and deeply personal or archetypal experiences that defied conventional logic. In works like Messengers of Deception, 1979, Vallée expressed concern that UFO narratives were being manipulated, whether by intelligence agencies, belief systems, or even the phenomenon itself, to construct misleading frameworks. The idea of straightforward spacecraft crashing in remote deserts didn't align with his view that the phenomenon might act more like an informational control system or a reality-modifying force. He questioned why an advanced intelligence, particularly one capable of interdimensional travel or altering human perception, would crash at all, a point still echoed today by many skeptics of the crash retrieval narrative. However, Vallée's stance evolved in later years, particularly through his collaboration with Dr. Gary Nolan on the study of anomalous materials allegedly recovered from UAP incidents. Together, they co-authored peer-reviewed research on metamaterials, fragments with isotopic and structural features not easily explained by known human technologies. Between 2017 and 2021, their findings, including the analysis of the so-called Council Bluffs sample and other pieces with unusual bismuth magnesium layering, suggested engineering beyond known aerospace capabilities. This marked a shift in Vallée's openness to integrating physical evidence into the broader conversation. Although Vallée never abandoned his focus on the symbolic and experiential aspects of UAP encounters, his later work reflects a more inclusive approach, one that allows physical trace evidence and crash retrievals to coexist with high strangeness rather than contradict it. From this perspective, such physical artifacts are not merely remnants of crashed vehicles, but may represent interfaces between dimensions or relics of interactions between differing layers of reality. This shift in approach highlights the importance of remaining open to multiple possibilities when attempting to interpret the phenomenon, both in terms of origin and in specific case studies. Setting aside personal beliefs is key to fostering more open and productive dialogue. Vallée himself likely recognized this long ago. While it's perfectly acceptable for individuals to lean towards certain interpretations based on their understanding of the evidence, it's counterproductive to dismiss other possibilities simply because they don't fit a favored narrative. Some critics argue that certain aspects of high strangeness associated with the IDH are logically inconsistent, but this largely depends on how the hypothesis is approached. Numerous interpretations exist that could account for the strangeness reported in many cases. If one entertains the idea that these experiences are shaped through subjective states of consciousness, or that non-human intelligences may exploit or manipulate our perception, then both the IDH and high strangeness deserve serious consideration, regardless of how difficult they are to categorize. Given our current stage of cognitive and technological development, it's reasonable to assume that our understanding of these events is limited. Our inability to fully comprehend either the actions of a highly advanced civilization or the properties of an alternate plane of existence only strengthens the case that many strange encounters are, in some real sense, authentic. They may simply lie beyond the scope of what we are currently capable of explaining. What does interdimensional really mean? Patrick Scott Armstrong, on his vetted YouTube channel, raises a compelling question during his breakdown of the Joe Rogan episode featuring Diana Walsh-Pasulka. He asks, how do we know what interdimensional really is? What does that even mean, considering we have no reference frame for what an interdimensional realm would look like, or whether such a realm even exists? How can we assign it that property? It's a fair challenge to one of the most casually invoked terms in modern UAP discourse. Even if interdimensional aspects of the phenomenon are real, that doesn't necessarily mean the intelligences involved originate from such a realm. They could simply be exploiting it, perhaps to instantaneously move through space, conceal their presence, or distort our perception of their craft. In that case, why should we introduce the foundational unknown of an interdimensional realm when the contingent unknown of UAP itself is already difficult enough to interpret? It may actually be counterintuitive to assume that a higher dimensional being, object, or domain could be observed by a lower dimensional entity like a human. If something is truly higher dimensional, it would, by definition, transcend our perceptual limits. For example, an ant perceives and operates in three-dimensional space to some degree, but it cannot comprehend a human being, let alone something beyond the third dimension. Likewise, it might be illogical to assume that we could recognize or interpret a higher dimensional intelligence or craft at all. If we are witnessing something that exhibits tangible qualities, textures, biology, mechanical elements, it's likely that what we're observing is, at minimum, three-dimensional in nature, even if it's capable of extraordinary feats. An advanced civilization will naturally appear magical to a less evolved one, so perhaps what we perceive as high strangeness is simply the byproduct of advanced technology beyond our understanding. The craft may employ higher dimensional principles to travel, alter appearance, or cloak themselves, but what we actually encounter, especially if it can crash and be recovered, suggests a solid three-dimensional object. If a being or craft genuinely originated from a higher dimensional realm, we might not be capable of perceiving it at all. That brings us back to the core question: are we dealing with origin or method? The goal is to determine the origin point of these intelligences, not merely the mechanisms they use to interact with our reality. Assuming the existence of an interdimensional realm as a point of origin introduces an entirely separate layer of speculation, one we have no evidence for and no way to test. It may therefore be premature to claim such a realm exists, let alone assert that it serves as the home of non-human intelligences. Doing so stacks a foundational unknown, interdimensional existence, on top of the contingent unknown of UAP as NHI. By contrast, we know that three-dimensional space exists, that it can be traversed, and that intelligent life has evolved here. Even if these beings are capable of faster-than-light travel, that doesn't mean they originate from the mechanisms used to achieve it. They may come from a physical planet in our own dimension, merely utilizing higher-dimensional shortcuts to reach us. If we argue that our biology and evolutionary development limit our ability to perceive or interpret these events accurately, then we must also admit that we are in no position to declare them interdimensional. To do so is to make an equally assumptive leap from within the same perspective. We cannot simultaneously claim ignorance and then use that ignorance as justification for a definitive conclusion. Without any parameters for what an interdimensional realm would even entail, let alone hard evidence for its existence, we are left with speculation. Until such evidence emerges, the more grounded interpretation may be that these are extraordinarily strange, yet still physical three-dimensional events. Their ability to interact with us physically supports this position. None of this is to say that higher dimensional realms are impossible or that they won't someday be confirmed. It's simply that we should begin with what we can observe and test. The strongest support for this approach comes from Clarke's famous observation: any sufficiently advanced technology will appear as magic to a less advanced civilization. If that's the case, then perhaps the high strangeness of UAP encounters reflects the vast gap between us and the intelligence behind them, not necessarily a breach from another dimension. Otherwise, we risk falling into the same trap as our ancestors, who interpreted unknown phenomena through the lens of fairies, demons, or angels. If the beings and objects we encounter are not those literal entities, then they must be something else, something that demands a scientific and physical framework if we hope to understand it meaningfully. While the scientific method may not be fully equipped to grasp the intricacies of an interdimensional reality, it remains the best tool we currently have. Dismissing the interdimensional hypothesis altogether because our tools are limited would be a mistake, but accepting it without evidence is just as misguided. If we're to seriously entertain it as a viable origin theory, we must include an asterisk. It is for now speculative, filtered through a limited, early 21st century Homo sapiens perspective. Different interpretations of the IDH. One interpretation of the interdimensional hypothesis is that non-human intelligences originate from alternate timelines in which evolution on Earth took different paths. In these scenarios, various intelligent species may have emerged, some of which developed the ability to traverse between parallel realities. In one such alternate history, for example, dinosaurs evolved to intelligence and were never wiped out by an asteroid, continuing their development without interruption. In another, mammals evolved similarly to our own timeline, but did so millions of years earlier. In that case, what we perceive as the typical gray NHI might actually be evolved Homo sapiens from an alternate Earth, rather than time travelers from our own future. If a method exists to traverse the multiverse, moving from one alternate version of Earth to another, it could help explain the wide variety of beings and craft witnessed throughout history. This would be especially compelling if the concept of time as we know it doesn't apply in the same way across the multiverse. Instead of a linear timeline, there would exist multiple overlapping present moments across the ever-persistent now, allowing traversal from one reality to another through interdimensional means. In these scenarios, however, and in many other variations that could be proposed, the NHI are still not originating from a higher dimensional realm. Rather, they would be making use of such a realm or mechanism in order to move between three-dimensional realities. Their origin would still be physical, just from a different version of 3D space. If these craft were truly interdimensional in origin, emerging from a higher dimensional realm entirely, it would follow that they might not exhibit any physical three-dimensional traits at all. The fact that witnesses often describe structured vehicles, biological features, and material evidence suggests there is a physical component. Therefore, it might be more reasonable to conclude that these intelligences are not from a higher dimensional space, but from a parallel or alternate 3D reality. They may utilize interdimensional mechanisms such as portals or wormholes to traverse realities, but that doesn't mean they originate from those mechanisms. This narrows the origin possibilities to one of three: another star system, an alternate 3D reality, or a different point in time. In doing so, it strips away the need for a metaphysical or paranormal explanation, returning the phenomenon to a physical framework that merely appears magical to our limited perception, a sentiment echoed by Arthur C. Clarke. Under this view, elements of high strangeness or apparent paranormality could be attributed to intentional obfuscation or subterfuge. Alternatively, one might argue that if the phenomenon truly does originate from a higher dimensional realm, that it would be inherently metaphysical, at least from our perspective. These would be non-physical beings, existing outside of our space-time framework and looking inward. They might have the ability to temporarily manifest or interact within our three-dimensional reality, but their essential nature would be non-physical. In that case, interpretations of them as gods, angels, or demons, while not necessarily literal, would make more conceptual sense than describing them as physical beings. Other IDH interpretations, however, lean toward parallel physical realities, making interdimensional a more accurate term than truly interdimensional, at least in terms of origin. Even if the phenomenon is paranormal and genuinely originates from a higher dimensional realm, our only way of understanding it is still through a three-dimensional lens. Whatever aspects affect us must do so within the framework of our physical reality in order to be perceived or measured. For us, a 3D interpretation is not only practical, but essential to constructing any meaningful understanding. Ethereal or metaphysical interpretations, while potentially valid, will always remain speculative and elusive, likely beyond our cognitive ability to fully grasp. That doesn't mean they should be dismissed, but their explanatory power is inherently limited. While it's legitimate to explore the high strangeness elements that might result from interdimensional interactions, these interpretations will likely lead to conceptual dead ends. We may never possess the capacity to fully understand what such beings are or why they are here. Even if they tried to explain it to us directly, our primitive mammalian cognition might simply not be able to comprehend the message. As such, we're left interpreting the phenomenon not as it is in itself, but as it filters through the narrow aperture of our three-dimensional human experience. High strangeness. Our understanding of the UAP phenomenon is inherently shaped by a 21st century human-centric perspective, or for some, still a 20th century one, depending on how entrenched they are in traditional scientific paradigms. While aspects of the phenomenon may appear metaphysical or saturated in what some dismiss as woo, that doesn't mean the underlying reality behind them falls outside a natural or scientific explanation of the universe. What we can't yet interpret doesn't automatically place it beyond the reach of natural law. We must be cautious not to prematurely declare that we're incapable of interpreting the phenomenon simply because of its high strangeness. To assume it is interdimensional because we can't make sense of it is still an assumption made from within our limited three-dimensional and evolutionary framework. This line of reasoning mirrors the error of the purely nuts and bolts camp, both rely on a narrow human-centric vantage point. Since all interpretation is filtered through our perceptual and cognitive limitations, we should avoid definitive claims and instead work within the boundaries of what we can observe and reasonably infer. Perhaps the most pragmatic path forward is to treat aspects of high strangeness as placeholders, components of an encounter that we acknowledge but refrain from explaining through metaphysical or speculative frameworks unless absolutely necessary. That doesn't mean we discard the high strangeness altogether. Rather, we suspend judgment, interpret what we can in three-dimensional terms, and approach the rest with humility. Many anomalous cases do include elements we can interpret, and those should be prioritized while we reserve deeper speculation for the unknowns. This strategy allows for a working model grounded in present human understanding without abandoning the more mysterious elements altogether. It's a balance between practical reasoning and open-ended inquiry. If the strange yet observable aspects of the phenomenon can be explained through either an interdimensional or a 3D interpretation, then perhaps we should lean toward the one that doesn't introduce an additional unknown. Occam's razor teaches us not to multiply entities unnecessarily. While philosophical and metaphysical discussions about the phenomenon are valuable, we should recognize that they rely on adding assumptions about realms or dimensions we have no direct evidence for. Keeping the interpretation simple and rooted in what we can verify allows for broader acceptance and more meaningful engagement, especially from the scientific community. That said, we must still admit that our perceptual faculties are limited. It's entirely possible that what we're witnessing does have a truly paranormal or non-physical quality, one that violates or bypasses our known understanding of physics. The phenomenon may even be intimately tied to human consciousness, manifesting in forms we are capable of perceiving, even if distorted or incomplete. In that sense, calling it interdimensional may simply be a placeholder term we've invented to describe something we fundamentally do not understand. This doesn't mean we must exclude such interpretations, but we should remain mindful of the limits they place on actionable understanding. From a strategic standpoint, it may be wise, especially for those attempting to legitimize NHI discussions, to hold off on assigning definitive interdimensional origins until there is solid evidence such a realm exists and can house an intelligence. Otherwise, we risk alienating both the scientific community and the general public. While this may not concern everyone, it's a crucial point for those aiming to foster serious engagement and support further research. An analogy helps make the point. A cat lives within the same 3D reality as humans, but cannot comprehend the function or nature of a computer chip. It has no need for an interdimensional explanation to account for its limited perception. The difference lies in cognitive capacity and understanding, not in access to reality itself. The same could be true for humans in relation to a vastly more advanced intelligence. Their technology might appear magical or impossible to us, not because it's interdimensional, but because we are cognitively unequipped to grasp the principles behind it. In this context, interdimensional may simply mean beyond our comprehension. This perspective reframes woo as potentially misunderstood science, not mysticism. Just because humans are prone to invoking God or the paranormal to explain what we don't understand doesn't mean there isn't a natural mechanism behind those phenomena. Whether it's telepathy, consciousness, or some other elusive feature of the universe, there may well be scientific principles at play that we are not yet equipped to understand. Consciousness, for example, may be a fundamental feature of reality, but one we can only conceptualize in crude terms given our current stage of development. Still, proponents of the IDH, like Jacques Vallée and others, may be offering a glimpse closer to the truth. The IDH doesn't have to be discarded outright. Instead, its implications can be translated into three-dimensional terms, allowing us to incorporate it into our understanding without fully embracing unverifiable assumptions. Our reality, though limited, is not invalid. It is still the framework through which we must engage with the unknown. Again, IDH supporters should be cautious when invoking Arthur C. Clarke's famous quote, "Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic." The key term here is indistinguishable. Clarke wasn't suggesting that the technology is magic, only that it appears so to a less advanced observer. This actually undercuts the interdimensional argument. It implies that seemingly magical technology may still operate within physical laws, just beyond our comprehension. Even if our interpretations are ultimately wrong, they may still be useful. Our best guesses, grounded in probability and available data, give us something to work with, something more productive than endlessly repeating that we just don't know. And for all we know, the NHIs themselves may be struggling with their own limitations. They may not be the apex of intelligence or understanding, and they too may yearn to grasp what lies beyond their current knowledge or level of reality. Just as we are trying to understand them, perhaps they are attempting to understand something even greater. In this light, it's reasonable to put faith in our best tentative models, even if they prove incomplete over time. Science doesn't require perfect answers, just better ones than before. It's not about claiming empirical truth, but about approximating probable truth in the best way we can. And in doing so, we move forward. Lastly, many of the characteristics that seem magical, such as sudden maneuvers or gravity-defying flight, might simply be unintended side effects of unfamiliar technology interacting with our sensory limitations. These effects may not be deliberate or metaphysical at all, but rather manifestations of advanced systems beyond our ability to decode. Our inability to fully make sense of them leads us to cry interdimensional, but that label may be unnecessary. It may simply be that we are too primitive to grasp the full scope of what we are observing. Human perception is extremely limited. Our visual range captures only a small fraction of the electromagnetic spectrum. Some animals see more, some less, but all are bound by biology. Insects, bats, and blind cavefish experience the world in ways radically different from ours. Yet none of this alters the physical laws that govern reality. So what if we too are only scratching the surface of the 3D world, let alone something more complex? Could it be that higher dimensions do exist, governed by the same physical principles, and we simply aren't evolved enough to witness them yet? If that's true, then we are far from having a complete picture of reality. But we may be moving closer, step by step, not by speculating wildly, but by building models that make the best use of what we can know now. Interdimensional as a paranormal phenomenon. Even if the UAP phenomenon is interdimensional in nature, does that automatically make it paranormal? Perhaps assigning it a paranormal, metaphysical, or even interdimensional label is premature. Just because we don't fully understand the phenomenon, its high strangeness, the role of consciousness, or its potential interactions with human perception, does not mean it should be placed outside the realm of science. A lack of understanding is not by itself evidence of metaphysical origin. The term interdimensional might not refer to a source of origin at all. It could simply be one feature or symptom of the phenomenon, an effect rather than a cause. Even if certain interdimensional characteristics are present, that doesn't necessarily mean non-human intelligences originate from such a realm. Many aspects of high strangeness could be side effects of how advanced technology interacts with our biological senses. For example, their apparent ability to pass through solid objects, move seamlessly through water or air, or cloak their presence may depend on physical principles we do not yet understand, possibly involving forms of physics that seem interdimensional only because of our cognitive and perceptual limitations. To interpret the phenomenon as interdimensional or paranormal without direct evidence that such a realm exists risks setting ufology back. It echoes a time when early witnesses intercepted unknown experiences through primitive frameworks, fairies, gnomes, angels, demons, assigning supernatural explanations to natural phenomena they couldn't comprehend. If paranormal phenomena are, by definition, interdimensional in origin, then explanations for such entities fall under the same speculative category. But should we accept these interpretations at face value, or should we strive for rational, evidence-based explanations that can hold up under scientific scrutiny? Simply because we do not understand something doesn't mean it should default to a paranormal explanation. That said, we must also acknowledge that an interdimensional or paranormal explanation may ultimately prove to be correct. Human intuition, especially among experiencers, may be pointing in that direction for a reason. Still, given the lack of empirical evidence for such realms, it may be more productive to temporarily set aside that interpretation in favor of one that seeks natural, testable explanations, at least until more data emerges. After all, the phenomenon could very well be based on natural laws that merely appear supernatural to us. Whether or not ghosts, telepathy, or cryptids are real is still up for debate. But if there is a metaphysical layer to reality, an interdimensional substrate beyond our measurement capabilities, then we shouldn't automatically dismiss related testimony. If we exist in something akin to a simulation or quantum program, then phenomena typically considered paranormal could be entirely real within that framework. More on that possibility later. What may be happening is a shift in language. People today may be reinterpreting what were once considered magical or divine experiences through the lens of modern theoretical physics. Where people once saw gods or angels, some now see interdimensional travelers or extra-dimensional projections. While it's an evolution in terminology, the problem remains. Adding unknowns without sufficient evidence complicates rather than clarifies. Even if the interdimensional hypothesis is valid, the better approach may be to interpret strange accounts through a grounded scientific lens first, treating the metaphysical explanation as a placeholder for what we don't yet understand. We may simply not be evolved enough to properly interpret this technology. That doesn't mean it's paranormal. It means our interpretations are shaped by our limitations. And recognizing those limitations is itself a step forward. Instead of repeating the interpretive mistakes of our ancestors, we should be able to say, we don't yet understand this, without defaulting to supernatural labels. Perhaps instead of calling NHI technology paranormal or interdimensional, we could adopt a new term, something like transphysical, to reflect our recognition of phenomena that lie outside conventional physical explanations without assuming mysticism. If consciousness is closely tied to how we perceive the phenomenon, then it's plausible that witness experiences are shaped by the era in which they occur. For example, Roman soldiers may have genuinely seen a burning shield in the sky, not because that's what the object was, but because that's how it was perceived based on their cultural context. This mental projection could have been influenced by NHI or the craft itself through telepathic suggestion or perceptual manipulation. The same could be said for 19th century airship sightings or modern-day owl encounters. The intelligence behind the phenomenon might present itself in forms that resonate with the expectations or subconscious imagery of the observer. This could explain the wide variety of reports across time, each shaped by the witness's mental schema. While patterns do emerge, such as metallic spheres, classic saucers, or gray humanoids, the variations may point to a kind of perceptual camouflage, suggesting we are being shown what we are capable of understanding at a given moment in our development. Perhaps the increasing consistency of reports since the mid-20th century means we are now better equipped to see the phenomenon for what it is. Or perhaps the deception has simply evolved to keep pace with our changing expectations. Still, we must consider the possibility that we are continuing to be deceived. The beings or intelligences behind the phenomenon may not resemble anything we can truly conceive. What we interpret as grays or flying saucers might be the latest version of a psychological interface, a mask that fits our time and culture. The true nature of the phenomenon may remain fundamentally unknowable. Independent researcher Patrick Jackson, author of Quantum Paranormal, offers a compelling reinterpretation of so-called paranormal experiences. He argues that glowing orbs, commonly reported at locations like Skinwalker Ranch, are not supernatural but technological. According to Jackson, these orbs may be part of a global surveillance or control network operated by non-human intelligences. Far from being ghostly anomalies, they are, in his view, intentional devices, possibly automated, capable of manipulating perception, influencing human behavior, and altering local physics in subtle ways. In Jackson's view, places like Skinwalker Ranch aren't haunted, but are zones where the system becomes temporarily visible. These orbs, he suggests, may operate through principles that lie at the intersection of quantum physics and consciousness. What we interpret as high strangeness could instead be engineered misdirection, camouflage systems embedded within these devices. The consistency of orb sightings across the globe in this interpretation isn't a coincidence or a mass delusion. It's evidence of a widespread and misunderstood infrastructure. In this context, what we casually label woo may just be evidence of our own cognitive limits. Dogs or cats, were they capable of abstract thought, might believe we are gods for the things we can do. But we know better. It's merely a matter of cognitive and perceptual gap. A better example might be showing a smartphone to someone from the Middle Ages. They would almost certainly cry magic or witchcraft, but not because the device is magical, because they lack the framework to understand it. All considered, perhaps we should avoid reverting to outdated modes of thinking. Instead of labeling the phenomenon as paranormal, we might aim to ground it in frameworks we can build upon, even if they are incomplete. This doesn't dismiss interdimensionality as a possibility, but it reframes it in terms we can actually work with. It's not a denial, it's a strategic re-evaluation. Calling something transphysical rather than metaphysical may allow for both scientific analysis and imaginative openness without resorting to pre-scientific thinking. If consciousness truly plays a role in how we perceive these encounters, then it's reasonable to expect the phenomenon to vary across time and context. What Roman soldiers saw as burning shields, or what 19th century witnesses saw as airships, may have been the same phenomenon witnessed today as flying saucers or glowing orbs, filtered through culture, language, and expectation. Perhaps we are now, at least some of us, finally beginning to glimpse these intelligences as they really are. Or perhaps we are simply falling for a new mask, better tailored to modern minds. Ultimately, we may never know the full truth, but we can and should interpret the phenomenon in terms that are useful, testable, and grounded in what we can currently understand. We don't have to rule out interdimensionality, but we should treat it as a hypothesis, not a conclusion. The true nature of these intelligences, if they exist, may remain forever beyond our reach, just as certain truths about us will remain forever beyond the comprehension of our pets or ancestors. But that doesn't mean we stop trying. Gods, angels, and demons. Non-human intelligences interpreted as gods, angels, or demons would naturally fall under the interdimensional umbrella, as such beings are typically thought to exist outside the constraints of normal space and time. Whether one interprets them literally as divine or infernal entities, or symbolically, the narrative still aligns with an interdimensional framework. For individuals with strong religious beliefs, especially those who already accept the phenomenon as real or have had personal encounters, it's understandable that they might fit NHI into a biblical or theological narrative. A benevolent encounter might be viewed as angelic or divine, while a traumatic or unsettling experience could be seen as demonic or evil. The nature of the encounter often dictates the label, filtered through the lens of the experiencer's cultural and spiritual background. If NHIs do exist in a form consistent with these interpretations, they may simply possess intentions, benevolent or malevolent, rather than embodying mythological forces of good and evil. The dichotomy of gods versus devils may not reflect any literal cosmic battle, but rather humanity's age-old attempt to categorize powerful forces as either helpful or harmful. Encounters with beings perceived as protective or enlightening could easily be cast as interactions with gods or angels, especially if witnessed in the sky or described as descending from the heavens. In contrast, encounters with frightening, invasive, or subterranean entities might be construed as demonic or infernal, particularly if they emerge from underground realms or cause psychological or physical distress. Over time, such interpretations may have crystallized into religious doctrine or folklore, finding their way into the sacred texts of many cultures. The notion of NHIs as divine beings could also be explored through an ultradimensional lens, a variation of the interdimensional hypothesis. In this interpretation, these entities may have played a role in our origin story, perhaps even guiding or accelerating our evolution. Initially, they might have been biological beings not unlike ourselves, but over time, they could have reached a level of advancement that allowed them to transcend their original state. Whether through technological ascension, consciousness expansion, or mastery of quantum reality, they may now exist in a realm outside the 3D universe, still capable of observing or interacting with it. If such entities did in fact create or influence our reality, perhaps through a quantum computational framework or by seeding our world with life, they would by definition be our creators. This wouldn't necessarily mean we live in a simulated environment in the traditional sense, but rather that the architecture of our universe might stem from their influence. From our limited vantage point, their reality might appear spiritual or ethereal, though in truth it could be entirely natural and scientific, just far beyond our current ability to perceive or understand. As with many other aspects of the phenomenon, what appears divine or mystical may, in time, reveal itself to be part of a higher order natural system we are only beginning to glimpse. Transuniversal architects and simulation theory. Another ultradimensional interpretation of the IDH aligns closely with simulation theory, a broader framing of what is technically referred to as the simulation hypothesis. Within this framework, the term transuniversal architects describes the creators or builders of the virtual reality construct in which we may be living. These hypothetical designers function as gods or godlike intelligences, though their origin could, in theory, stem from any of the four major NHI origin models: extraterrestrial, ultraterrestrial, extratempestrial, or interdimensional. Yet their true nature may lie outside all of these categories, something we have not yet conceived of and may never fully comprehend. Some might even equate them with God in the literal sense. It's possible that the very definition of interdimensional intelligence could encompass such architects, beings that exist outside of our physical universe, looking in. If so, then they would represent the ultimate interdimensional phenomenon, shaping not just reality, but the framework in which all other phenomena, including UAP and NHI, occur. Still, one could argue that ufology should not focus on the metaphysical origin of reality itself, but rather on the origin of the phenomenon within that reality. Even if the universe is a simulation, the physical beings and craft observed within it might be as unaware of the simulation as we are. They could be participants in the same manufactured universe, biological, technological, and measurable. The origin of these NHIs, then, may lie not with the simulation's creators, but within the simulation itself. From a ufological perspective, it may be more practical to pursue the origin of the craft and intelligences we can observe, rather than attempt to decode the nature of the simulation's ultimate designers. If our universe is indeed simulated, and the architects originated from an alternate 3D reality with a different evolutionary history, they would still be interdimensional from our perspective. Whether they were advanced dinosaurs from a parallel Earth, aliens who evolved elsewhere and created the simulation, or future humans who launched an ancestor simulation, all would be interdimensional creators in relative terms. Such beings might have developed the ability to create fully autonomous realities, each seeded with infinite worlds and alternate histories. They might also actively participate in these simulations, entering and exiting them at will. If so, then perhaps there is only one simulation built upon the architecture of the original universe, and we are part of that singular construct. If the universe was created using an advanced quantum-like computer, then these architects would, in effect, be our gods. The term transuniversal architect becomes a modern rebranding of the ancient concept of God. Moreover, any sufficiently advanced intelligence within the simulation, whether extraterrestrial, cryptoterrestrial, or future human, could perform feats so far beyond our comprehension that they would equally be viewed as divine. However, from the standpoint of the simulation, even they might be creations of the architects, subject to the same limitations and existential mysteries as we are. It is worth considering that the NHIs observed in our skies may themselves be unwitting participants in this simulation. They too may be biological entities that evolved within a constructive universe, whether aware of its artificial nature or not. In this scenario, the true interdimensional architects would not be the ones flying craft or interacting with humans. Instead, the NHIs might only account for the mundane side of the phenomenon, those cases involving physical craft and occupants. The more ethereal or high strangeness aspects, those that seem to defy space, time, or matter, could be glimpses of the architect's deeper reality. A structured craft caught on camera may be a cryptoterrestrial, extraterrestrial, or extratempestrial vehicle, while a surreal, shape-shifting entity might represent a rare window into a higher realm of existence. That said, even physical beings from alternate timelines or realities could technically be considered interdimensional, simply because they cross from one universe into another. They may be no more advanced than us, yet appear interdimensional from our standpoint. In this view, interdimensional is a relative term, describing not just the nature of the being, but our frame of reference in relation to it. In a simulated universe, every NHI origin theory could technically be true. Cryptoterrestrials, extraterrestrials, and time travelers could all coexist within an interconnected multiverse simulation. That means that only the foundational intelligence responsible for constructing the simulation would, by definition, be the only thing interdimensional. They would represent the only true origin point of existence, just not the origin point of any NHI that interacts with us within the program. Unless, of course, they are the only thing behind the phenomenon, sometimes manifesting themselves to us when they directly interact with their program. The question then becomes, who are they? Are they a species millions or billions of years more advanced than us, evolving from a base reality long before our simulation began? Or are they something even more alien, a consciousness or life form completely outside the categories of biology, technology, or matter? These possibilities create challenges in defining what interdimensional even means from our perspective. Does it refer to a being who traverses between realities, one who created the simulation, or simply one who exists in a higher dimensional state. The terms begin to blur, creating philosophical paradoxes and contradictions. So how should we proceed? If we weigh the probabilities, it may be more likely that we are living in a simulation, where practically anything is possible, than in a purely natural multiverse governed by consistent physical laws. Especially if consciousness is primary, the simulation hypothesis provides a compelling explanation for cases of high strangeness, in which reality appears to glitch, bend, or reshape around the experiencer. If consciousness is the engine of reality, then phenomena like orbs, cryptids, time anomalies, and telepathy may be expected outcomes in a shared, conscious-driven program. In that case, high strangeness may be less about violating the laws of physics and more about experiencing the artifacts of a simulation operating beyond our understanding. Consciousness would not only be real, it would be the only thing that's real, at least within the simulation. Even so, in the context of ufology, it may be more productive to focus on what we can physically detect and analyze. If we can photograph it, measure it, or engage with it, then it belongs to the domain of science. The intelligence behind the simulation, the interdimensional architect, may be forever beyond our reach. For that reason alone, our true focus should be on the observable intelligences within the simulation, not the divine architect who coded it into existence. But if the architect is directly tied to the phenomenon, then approaching it in that manner may provide us with only half the story. Still, we may consider ourselves lucky just getting that much, and may not ever acquire the ability to obtain the rest. In the end, the distinction matters. The UAP phenomenon might reflect the actions of intelligences that are themselves bound to the same simulated rules we are. They may be highly advanced, but not omniscient. The simulation's creators may have no direct role in UAP phenomena, just as software engineers don't control the decisions of characters in a video game once the simulation is running. Their involvement may be limited to establishing the parameters and letting events unfold. Getting back to the topic at hand. Some theoretical physicists and philosophers argue that consciousness gives rise to matter, not the other way around. If true, that would explain why quantum anomalies, like the observer effect, wave function collapse, and non-local entanglement, persistently challenge our understanding. Perhaps this reality was designed to only function in the presence of conscious observers. That would explain why the scientific community often resists such interpretations. They are subconsciously defending a model of reality that assumes we aren't inside a simulation. In a conscious-driven simulation, high strangeness may be a byproduct of how the system renders experiences. Reports of cryptids, ghosts, alien beings, and mythical creatures could be the natural result of conscious entities encountering each other across multiple layers of the program. Crossover points, glitches, or intersections between simulations could allow for bleed-through events in which beings or environments from other realities are temporarily witnessed. Any idea or archetype conceivable by the mind could theoretically manifest in such a world, especially if imagination and consciousness play a role in shaping simulated outcomes. From this view, the IDH, reframed through simulation theory, could explain the full spectrum of anomalous events, not as violations of physical law, but as expressions of a deeper consciousness-bound architecture. If that's true, then the real architects of reality are not just outside our universe, they are also within it, distributed through the consciousness of all sentient beings. We might all be fragments of that original intelligence, shaping the simulation from within. In this context, it would be a living, participatory realm born of shared consciousness and collective imagination. Life and matter as we know them might be the dream, a constructed reality generated by an intelligence that exists in higher dimensions or outside our simulation. From that intelligence's perspective, our universe could be little more than speculative fiction, a deliberately designed experiment, playground, or artistic expression whose purpose is to produce a distributed, self-reflecting consciousness. Think of it as an enormously ambitious work of world building. Creators set rules, seed life, and let the system evolve so that the emergent minds within it eventually reflect back on their makers. In this view, our movies, games, and virtual worlds are embryonic analogs, lower dimensional attempts to simulate richer realities, and future advances, quantum computation, immersive VR, may allow us to do the same. The implication is humbling. If our reality is itself an artifact, then the distinction between creator and created blurs, and the phenomena we study, including UAP and NHI, may be as much a feature of the program's design as they are events within the program. If we accept that possibility, then we must also accept that some intelligence, alien, human, or otherwise, was responsible for initiating the simulation. Whether they came from an alternate Earth, another galaxy, or another dimension entirely, their existence becomes necessary for the simulation to begin. If they are still observing us, perhaps as player characters entering their creation, then occasional sightings of them would be expected. And if our individuality is an illusion, then we might all be fragments of that same intelligence, momentarily self-aware within the game. In that case, the search for NHI origin may ultimately lead back to ourselves, or at least to the mind that imagined us into being. Cosmic consciousness. Could there be an underlying spiritual or metaphysical dimension to the universe that explains some of the stranger aspects of the UAP phenomenon? And if so, are these metaphysical features directly tied to the phenomenon itself? Or are they separate, unrelated events we've unknowingly grouped together? It's possible that what we interpret as spiritual or ethereal may simply be a highly advanced scientific reality that we have yet to evolve enough to comprehend. The phenomenon may appear mystical only because our current understanding is too primitive to decode what we're actually experiencing. Is it also possible that our consciousness plays an active role in shaping what we witness? If perception is not passive but participatory, if consciousness is not merely an observer but a force of creation, then we might be generating these realities collectively. In that case, every major NHI origin theory, ETH, UTH, ETM, CTH, or IDH, could be simultaneously true, not as competing theories, but as coexisting manifestations within a conscious-driven universe. This is especially plausible in the context of a simulated reality, where consciousness could be both the input and the output of the system. The designers of this reality, assuming there are any, might be the same beings piloting the anomalous craft we observe in our skies. Or they might be just like us, participants within the program, unaware of its true nature. Alternatively, they may not be beings at all in any traditional sense, but instead manifestations of a living universe that operates through consciousness itself. In this framework, every conscious entity, human, non-human, or otherwise, would be a fragment of a larger unified awareness. The distinction between creator and creation would begin to dissolve. If consciousness is indeed the primary driver of reality, then all ontological boundaries begin to blur. God would exist, though perhaps not as traditionally imagined. Aliens visiting Earth, ghosts, psychic phenomena, cryptoterrestrials, time-traveling humans, even manifestations of myth and archetype, all could be real, all simultaneously true, and all products of an underlying conscious substrate. And this wouldn't require a simulated universe to be so. A natural universe where consciousness is intrinsic could produce the same outcome. Conversely, a simulation designed with consciousness at its core would operate in much the same way. In either scenario, whether reality is metaphysical in origin or a construct that generates metaphysical experiences, The universe would be both physical and non-physical, both measurable and symbolic. Its true nature would be shaped by the conscious agents participating in it. What we now call high strangeness might simply be the result of our collective creative potential interacting with a universe that responds to awareness. In such a cosmos, anything we imagine, or have yet to imagine, might retroactively become real. The only remaining question is whether this realm is fundamentally metaphysical in nature, or whether it is a simulated environment designed to appear metaphysical under certain conditions. Either way, the mechanism behind what we call reality may be more malleable, participatory, and consciousness-driven than we ever dared to imagine. Final thoughts. The vast number of credible cases involving a wide variety of apparent craft and beings aligns well with an interdimensional interpretation. If many different types of entities are capable of traversing multiple realities or dimensions, such an explanation could rival the ETH, especially if intelligent life elsewhere in the galaxy is rare or has never discovered Earth. It would also seem to weaken the ETM, which assumes encounters involve strictly human-like beings, particularly the Greys. While the CTH could account for some variation through independent evolutionary pathways across Earth's deep history, the sheer diversity of reports might instead point toward an interdimensional or extraterrestrial origin. That said, this interpretation also depends on eyewitnesses being free from sensory manipulation by a single intelligence that either intentionally or inadvertently presents itself as multiple intelligences. Various factors could distort this perception: inadvertent visual effects from advanced propulsion systems, intentional camouflage designed to disguise nuts and bolts craft, or direct telepathic influence over human perception. The appearance of multiple intelligences might therefore result from technological or biological interference, exploiting our limited sensory and cognitive abilities to obscure their true nature. If confusion is part of their concealment strategy, then what we interpret as interdimensional may instead be deliberate obfuscation from a single intelligence, or at the very least a much smaller number of intelligences. As discussed earlier, high strangeness too can support an interdimensional or metaphysical interpretation, but such accounts may also be misleading. Some cases may not be strange in themselves, but only appear so because of our limited perceptual framework. Still, the simplest explanation could be that the phenomenon is genuinely strange precisely because it is interdimensional, something outside our capacity to comprehend with the 21st century human brain. Eyewitness reports and videos of what look like portals or gateways lend additional weight to the IDH. Yet even here we must be careful. Such gateways may not represent origins, but rather methods. Physical beings could be utilizing interdimensional pathways without actually originating from them. Their technology may simply exploit higher dimensional mechanics in order to function. Even if the phenomenon is ultimately interdimensional, we should be cautious with the term itself. We are attempting to describe a higher dimensional reality from within a three-dimensional perspective. It is possible that we are not even equipped to formulate meaningful concepts of such realms, let alone understand them. This may, in fact, be the very point. Interdimensional realities defy our comprehension, and our use of the term reflects that limitation. It is also possible that what we are calling interdimensional is something entirely separate from the UAP phenomenon, and that the two are unrelated but conflated because of overlapping experiences. High strangeness may belong to one domain, while physical craft and beings may belong to another. If so, we may be confusing two different realities, however real each may be on its own terms. Ultimately, it is as much an error for those who insist on a purely nuts and bolts interpretation to dismiss the IDH as it is for proponents of the IDH to claim high strangeness definitely proves interdimensional origins. every logically consistent hypothesis deserves to remain on the table. Unknown scientific principles could just as easily account for aspects of the phenomenon we currently classify as paranormal. Even if these principles lie beyond our present capacity to discern, they may still operate within a 3D framework. Whether NHIs are interdimensional, ethereal, telepathic, or capable of manipulating portals, their abilities may eventually be explained through science we have yet to discover. For now, the phenomenon may be one of two things: either genuinely interdimensional, paranormal, and metaphysical in nature, or entirely 3D and physical but designed to confuse and mislead, producing only the appearance of interdimensionality. Both possibilities remain open, and it is conceivable that more than one type of phenomenon is occurring simultaneously. For now, the UFO community should avoid both certainty and snap judgments. What matters most is not which theory is correct at this stage, but how we process, interpret, and relate to the evidence available to us. For those willing to remain open, the best approach may be to work with what we can currently understand and accept the limits of our comprehension. Even if answers are eventually offered by the phenomenon itself, we may not be able to fully grasp them, or they may be deceptive by nature. In the meantime, perhaps we can formulate tentative models that reflect what little we can comprehend. All of these possibilities will be put to the test in the next and final installment of the NHI Origin miniseries, the NHI Origin Likelihood Chart. This chart will provide a comparative grading system based on the available evidence for each origin hypothesis. While it may bring us closer to identifying the most probable explanation, it will not provide a definitive answer. Even if the lowest scoring hypothesis later proves to be the actual truth, the chart will still serve as a valuable tool for weighing present possibilities. At its core, it is designed to help us better evaluate what is most likely, not to dictate what is ultimately true. Thank you again for watching or listening, and I hope you'll join me next time as we conclude this mini-series and Season 1 of the program with the Likelihood Chart. Take care, everyone, and I'll see you then.